I'm Sandy Close, Director of Ethnic Media Services and your moderator. Anthony Advincula, our National Media Director, joins in Atlanta. And I want to give a special thanks to One Arizona for their help in organizing today's briefing. Our topic is redistricting in Arizona, the process by which the Independent Redistricting Commission, known as the IRC, a 5-member body appointed by the legislature, will redraw the boundaries for congressional and legislative districts to align with demographic changes documented by the 2020 census. How the IRC draws these boundaries could have important political consequences in a state where Republicans have lost seats over the last decade and the state's voters have moved from red to more competitively balanced. The commission, as the Associated Press recently reported, could let that trend continue or tip the scales by how it divides up populations and registered voters. Between July 23rd and late August, the IRC held 15 listening tours to solicit public input and produced a grid map that breaks the state's 7.15 million people into equal parts. As it prepares to draw more detailed draft maps, it has scheduled 5 public hearings to get additional public input. I believe the first one is scheduled today in Mesa, but we'll learn more from Victoria Ochoa very soon. The draft map is due October 27th. The final map is scheduled to be approved December 22nd. Today's speakers represent a broad coalition of community organizations working to ensure equitable representation for all Arizonans, particularly communities of color and rural residents. They will share their experiences trying to access the first round of hearings, highlight the issues that matter most to their communities, and outline their demands for greater transparency, representation, and accessibility by the Commission. We're honored to present Victoria Ochoa, Redistricting Manager for One Arizona, Reginald Boulding, Co-Director of Arizona Coalition for Change and candidate for Arizona State Secretary, Sandy Ochoa, Tucson Coordinator for Mi Familia Vota, Jennifer Chow, Executive Director of Arizona AANHPI, Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, Pacific Islanders for Equity, Janie Parrish with Navajo County Democrats, and Andrea Varela of Rural Arizona Engagement, a terrific lineup. Each of our 6 speakers has only 8 minutes. We will take questions as time allows. Reporters should enter questions in the chat box, and we ask speakers to monitor those questions and answer what ones you feel qualified to answer on the chat box throughout the conference. We will send everyone a video of today's conference, a who's who of speakers with contact information, and a fact sheet by EMS about redistricting in Arizona. We ask speakers to speak slowly for our interpreters. And now we begin with our first speaker, Victoria Ochoa of One Arizona, to provide an overview of Arizona's increasingly diverse population and what she sees at stake for communities of color in the redistricting process. Thank you, Victoria.
Thanks so much, Sandy, for having us here and for giving us the opportunity to share about this process in our state. As most folks, Arizona has had an increase of population of nearly 12% from 2010, and that population has largely been driven by communities of color. We know that Latinos are now over 30% of the population, in the state. We know that the Black population grew over 30% in the state, and we know that Asian Americans are actually the fastest growing population here. So considering all of the growth that's coming in from our communities, it's absolutely critical that we are incorporated into this process, that we're included, and that we are constantly asked for advice and for feedback as the commission rolls forward in a process that's going to impact our next 10 years here. Specifically with the commission, there's been a number of things that they have not done yet to address communities of color. They have been doing this work for the past 8 to 9 months now.
Excuse me, Victoria, could you just go a little slower? Our interpreters are saying they're trying to keep up.
Absolutely. The commission has now been doing this work for about 8 to 9 months now, and yet we're still not seeing enough support or enough outreach to communities of color. Namely, we are seeing that as they're reaching out to communities to obtain these hearings, to make sure that they're actually getting public input as we're getting closer to the maps, the commission has not actually done its work. In the first round of hearings, we had a 2-week notice that the hearings were going to happen, and we only had one location in a predominantly Latino area. We know that there were very few locations for the Navajo Nation, for example, with only Window Rock being one of the locations in the first round of hearings. And yet there was also a capacity issue at that hearing where not everyone was allowed to come in and speak. And Janie may actually be able to offer some more specific information on this, but we just know that they have not done enough with the first round of hearings. Having seen that firsthand from our community partners and our community members, we made sure that we reached out to the commission and that we made it very clear what we needed, especially as it comes to hosting these hearings in communities of color. And yet we have not seen a real improvement here in this next round either. They will only be hosting 2 hearings in predominantly Latino communities, and yet they're going to Scottsdale twice. So we are very clearly seeing that the commission is not prioritizing communities of color. We know that it's not just about reaching out to communities and just hosting these hearings in our communities, but also a number of additional accessibility and transparency issues. The first one that we've noticed here with the second round of hearings is we had an even shorter notice about them happening. We had a 1-week notice that the hearings were going to be occurring, giving community members only 1 week to coordinate any childcare needs, any transportation, any time off from work. And 1 week truly is not enough for folks to be able to adjust their schedules and make sure that they know what is happening with the commission and what the commission is even asking for regarding input in this next round of hearings. We know that they did not actually reach out to multilingual media outlets to help in these efforts. With only 1 week to advertise the hearings, you would think that the commission would reach out to as many media outlets as possible, as many multilingual media outlets, to actually ensure that communities are hearing about this and are aware that these hearings are happening and coming to some, if not all, of their communities. We know that there was a lack of consistency with translation and interpretation services in the first round. To my knowledge, there were no interpretation services on the Navajo Nation location previously, and there was a real inconsistency with Spanish translation at some of our previous hearings. For example, at the very last Mesa hearing during the first round, 70% of the room was not even inside of the hearing location when they announced that they had Spanish interpretation available. Many people didn't hear that that service was available or heard that statement being said in English only. How can people request these services if they're not even being offered in their own language? So we're seeing a number of these issues pop up time and time again. We know that the commission had an opportunity to improve on this from last time, and yet it actually failed to do that. It did things worse. 1 week notice for hearings that start on weekdays at 4 p.m., which is impossible for most working folks to be able to join, to make it there on time or even get there when the commission may still be there to listen to them. Even beyond that, there is no opportunity to participate in these hearings virtually. We know that COVID is still a massive issue in our country and particularly in our state. And with no additional COVID precautions, there was no real opportunity to participate virtually. We know that COVID has disproportionately impacted communities of color, and yet the commission is not considering that and how that may impact input. With no opportunities for virtual input, it really just comes down to attending a hearing that you didn't hear about, that is not scheduled in your community, and that is not scheduled at a time that works for you. Any other opportunities for input as far as maps go are only really able to be done through the commission's virtual mapping tool. That tool is only available in English. There have not been any training materials offered in additional languages. And even then, that tool is really difficult for folks to access. We heard during that first round that people were having difficulty sending in a drawing of their own communities of interest based on the original tool the commission provided. And now they've provided an even more difficult tool for folks to learn and to submit their own maps. The tool itself comes with a number of issues. Folks cannot submit their own districts, for example. They have to submit a statewide map. So people that are unfamiliar with other parts of the state have to draw a map of the entire state and not just of their own districts and their own communities. So truly, the commission has not done the work to make themselves accessible to us, to actually work with us. And although many folks have reached out to the commission, either by email, by letter, by attending a hearing and really directly stating what these issues are, we have not heard from the commission. The commission has not reached out to us to ask for our feedback, to ask how they may be able to work with us, when a number of the organizations, for example, just in the One Arizona Coalition, already have community expertise, they have the trust of the community, and they know how to reach community. We know that this is a process that has a very limited time frame, and yet the commission has not done this work. I would love to then kick it over for the next few folks to share out their efforts and what they've been doing to reach community, but really want to emphasize that these community partners have been doing the work and have been attempting to reach the commission, and yet the commission has not worked with us and has not reached out to us. There are a number of issues to be addressed, and we thank you for being here and listening to us as we share out what are some of our experiences.
Could I ask you one quick question before we go to Mr. Bolding?
Absolutely.
What issue do you think best exemplifies the absence of representation or inequitable representation? What fires up the activists working to get more representation on these hearings?
I think specific to the commission, the one issue is the hearing locations not being in our communities. I think aside from the actual commission and the commission's work, just access to funding, for example, federal resources and state legislative resources that we cannot advocate for because we are not in this process looking ahead. So being able to get funding for, COVID vaccine locations or for schools, those are all issues that ultimately are based on redistricting and will impact the next 10 years. So access to funding is just one of the biggest ones that our commissioners are not really thinking how that's going to impact communities of color in the long run.
Thank you so much. That was a terrific overview. We're now going to go to Reginald Bolding. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. You are co-director of the Arizona Coalition for Change and a candidate for the Arizona State Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Bolding. Tell us your perspective on the redistricting process, especially from the vantage of Arizona's growing African-American population.
Thank you, Sandy. So as mentioned, I am the co-executive director of the Arizona Coalition for Change, and also I serve as the House Democratic leader in the Arizona House of Representatives. One of the things that I think is extremely important for us to look at is the Independent Redistricting Commission and redistricting in a cycle in which we have seen a lack really of state investment from the beginning when we talk about Census 2020. What we know here is that the city of Phoenix, we know Maricopa County, and we know the state of Arizona is growing. And particularly, we also know not only in our communities of color, but also in the African American community, to be more specific as well, we're seeing a growing population of individuals here. What we saw is an undercount with regards to the census data, there's no way that we could be a city, a county, a state that's growing without that growth being represented in our census count. And that was primarily because of a lack of investment at the state level very on, when many community organizations were lobbying the state government, were asking the executive to place more resources to ensure that we're getting more people counted, because we knew that the outcomes of the census would actually play a significant role as we began to look in redistricting as well. And what we saw was a lack of investment. So community organizations like the Arizona Coalition for Change, back in 2020, we began our own process of making sure that folks in the African American community knew how to participate in the census so they can ensure that they were counted. We started something called Black Census 2020 because we knew the effect and the role that this would play on the 2021 IRC and the drawing of the line. So that was extremely important. Currently, right now, what the Arizona Coalition for Change is doing is filling the gaps of the IRC, and that should not be the role of community groups. We shouldn't have to fill the gaps, particularly in the African American community or other community, because the state has failed to do so. So we are holding bi-weekly education redistricting meetings in which we're informing the African American community primarily of the redistricting process itself, but then also where they can actually participate to have their voices heard. As Victoria mentioned, we have been not extremely excited by the fact that we have not seen these meetings in communities, in African American communities. The day in which you can just go to South Phoenix and have that as the only opportunity for African American voices to be heard, those days no longer exist. Quite frankly, African Americans here in the state of Arizona are in all different districts or in all different cities. In fact, the city of Maricopa has the largest percent population of African Americans of any city. So making sure that that voice is heard in the city of Maricopa is extremely important. So for us, what we want to do is be extremely vigilant in making sure that there's more access to people to have their voices heard. And if we cannot have those voices heard, we don't believe that there would be a redistricting process that will be equitable and one that actually would represent the state. Another underlining issue, as was mentioned as well, is we are currently in the middle of of COVID, a pandemic, right? And the Delta variant and what's happening with COVID is affecting communities of color at a more broad level than it's affecting other communities. So providing as many opportunities as possible for voices to be heard, such as virtual settings, make the most sense in this scenario, in this point of time. There's no way that we can be a state that talks about innovation, that talks about using telecommunications and ways to actually participate, even when we just had a state legislature that had a virtual opportunity to create state laws, that we are now not allowing virtual options for communities of color to have their voices heard on a redistricting process that will have decade-long implications. So we will continue to be extremely vigilant in making sure that voices are heard from communities of color, and we look forward to additional questions. And Sandy, I think you're on mute.
You are so, thank you. First question comes from Floyd Galloway. Could you ask your question, Mr. Galloway? But you have to keep it short because we're so limited with time.
Yeah, my question was, how's the commission held responsible to the community and to people as far as who regulates them, and how can the community make an impact and making sure that the commission is doing the job that they're supposed to be doing, reaching out to all types of people of color, communities of color?
Yeah, so one of the when you have an independent redistricting committee, I think that there's a lot of positive things that can come from an independent redistricting committee, but there's also gaps as well. And right now, you have the Commission of Appellate Courts, which actually has a process that allows the governor to select members who are eligible to serve as commissioners. So what we saw this last cycle is that the governor chose a group of individuals who would actually be part of a list that some may believe may not have been representative of the parties, whether Republican, Democratic, Independent, Green Party, Libertarian. Some may have not believed it was a true representation of all individuals. Currently, right now, the leader of the House, the Democratic leader of the House, and the Speaker of the House, and also the Democratic leader of the Senate and the President of the Senate, they can select individuals from this governor-approved list to serve as members of the commission. And then from there, the commission, those 4 members, then select a chairperson. And right after that process has taken place, the commission pretty much in its stage is almost an unregulated body. Those commissioners have the ability and the full autonomy to move as they choose. So after the selection process, they very much will choose to move as they should. So it really is unregulated.
Well, this sounds like a great topic for a radio interview. And thank you for your question. We have time for one more question from Leo Aroman on the chat. Can you ask your question, Leo?
What's his name on that?
Aroman. Sorry, we're just, Oni, do you have his question? We just are so limited on time. If we can't find him.
So this is his question.
Great.
The growing population of Blacks, immigrants, and other people of color, how do you envision building up a coalition of this group?
Great question.
I think not only myself, but Victoria and others on the call can speak of that, is that I don't think that we no longer have to sort of envision what a coalition could look like, because we've created it. And through the One Arizona table and our partner organizations that are currently here today, they'll be able to talk and speak to how we've collaboratively worked together to make sure that all voices are heard. We don't believe in this idea that one community needs to pit itself versus another. We truly believe that whether you are Black, Brown, Native, or Asian Pacific Islander, whoever, that all voices absolutely need to be heard. And I think this coalition has actually worked together collectively to make sure all of our voices are heard.
Thank you. Mr. Bolding, I realize you have another call. You may not be able to stay on for the end. Is there a single message you feel ethnic media could help amplify about the redistricting process that would most help this coalition of advocates?
I think the biggest issue and the biggest opportunity for ethnic media right now is the education process, because what we know is communities of color right now are dealing with so much. In many of our communities with regards to COVID, people of color were the first ones fired and the last ones hired back, which means that, you know, economic stability is an issue still for communities of color, and they're dealing with the economic issue of their own households right now. We also know with regards to policies that are directly taking place that are beyond just what's happening in the economy are compounding with our communities of color. But we also know that the redistricting process and who will be representing us for the next 10 years have the ability to impact both our economic situations and policies that are directly impacting communities of color. So by elevating this conversation to the front of the page, so our community knows that today, while the IRC may seem like a very nebulous topic and subject, that it may seem unforeign, this will have a profound impact over the next 10 years and can actually provide an opportunity for our communities to make sure that we truly have a voice and a seat at the table in state government, state and federal government.
Thank you so much for joining us. We're now going to go to Sandy Ochoa, who is the Tucson director of Mi Familia Vota, which has been a great partner with EMS all over the country. Thank you, Sandy.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. I am so thankful for being here and thankful for you all being here to share the safe space that we can speak about this and get this moving to where we need to go. Redistricting is the next fight in the battle to protect our democracy. The same anti-democratic forces that are trying to hold on to power by pushing voter suppression bills in the states will also attempt to manipulate the maps in their favor doing redistricting. Gerrymandering is a key part of conservatives' plan to secure majorities in the House of Representatives and state legislators for the next decade, regardless of what the voters want. They've already set the plan to use the power they hold at the state level to secure a decade of conservative power. They're openly telling people their game plan: reduce the number of competitive seats nationwide, limit progressive urban centers, and shrink the congressional battlefield where Democratic candidates can compete. In Arizona, that means they want to limit the political power of Latinos. Mi Familia Vota's mission is to build the political power of our community and will not stand for injustice. Mi Familia Vota will fight these attacks on our democracy. We are the community working year-round to educate and push back against those vicious attacks. Therefore, we must restore transparency and accountability to this process. That is why we must pass For Our Future Act.
Can we now take some questions, Sandy? And I'm so glad you put this in the context of voter rights, voting rights. The first question comes from Juan Juarez at Telemundo. Mr. Juarez, can you ask your question?
Hi, thank you. I appreciate it. I just wanted to ask regarding the process. I mean, how important is it for the public to be involved, and what could be the impact that it could have on just the way that the situation should be handled with the setting up the new maps and for the districts? And what do you ask the commission to do exactly, since you guys mentioned at the beginning a couple of the limitations that were happening with regards to the meetings and the accommodations and everything else? If you guys can elaborate more on these few things that I just mentioned.
So what happened, I'm going to draw back to the first hearings that we had. What didn't happen is they didn't go into the minority districts that needed to be given this information that was going on. They picked very different districts that, you know, that weren't really people of color. We felt that it was a huge disadvantage to the minorities because they weren't being heard, their voices were not being heard. So we need to push on that now with the hearings that are coming up, that everything is being more transparent and more better for the communities to be able to join and send out some type of, like, let them know what's going on. It was just the way it was done. It was so I don't want to say, I'm going to say they did not go where they needed to have the meetings be held at, so that people could have their voices heard, where the hearings were heard.
Right. And we're going to hear a similar theme, I think, from our next speaker, Jennifer Chow, with the Arizona AANHPI for Equity. Jennifer, can you follow up with Sandy's presentation and the question we had from Mr. Juarez?
Yeah, and good morning, everyone. So AZ and HPI for Equity, we are a coalition of 9 ANHPI organizations working together on issues that impact our community. So I could speak first about like our experience. I would say I went to Tucson with our partners up in Pan Asian Community Alliance. They have a community center out there, but we went to the hearing, and when we walked in, I would say there was about 200 people. It was a pretty jam-packed room. We were the only Asians there. I would say 95% of the people in that Tucson public hearing were white. Handful of, it was just me and 3 other Asian community members. I think, you know, the Black community, 3 or 4. Sandy, I saw Sandy, she brought her team. The Indigenous Native community, there was 3. So think about that. There was just 95% were white. So what I was, and then I went to the next meeting in Mesa, which was the next day, which was a little bit better. There were more people of color, but we were still like, even the Asian community, there was still like a handful. But when I did my testimony, I did mention, I was like, it was, when I approached them, I said, it was really eye-opening when I went to the Tucson public hearing, because there was only a handful of our communities of color that were there. So I'm trying to figure out what efforts did the IRC make to reach out to the ANHPI community, to the Latinx community, the Black community, Indigenous Native communities. Like, what did they do to outreach? So how did these 95% of white communities know that this meeting is existing? So that was something that I highlighted in my testimony. But yeah, and that's something that, you know, I think each one of us mentioned. It's like, we need better outreach of communities of color, translation services. And, but I feel like maybe the ethnic media would help out. But at the end of the day, IRC should be doing better at outreaching, if that answers some of the questions. But I do want to start off, I do have a quick presentation, hopefully it's quick. I want to talk about some of the things that our organization has been doing. Let me start this. Can people see my slide? Okay. Okay, so we did do some trainings. I think educating our community is really important when it comes to redistricting, for example. So we did hold a redistricting training in partnership with API Vote. And we had about 49 people participate. It was via Zoom. And we did ask the question, what is your knowledge on redistricting? And this is right before the training. We used the Mentimeter. And from 0 to 5, how knowledgeable are you redistricting process in your state? So it was 0.8. So that's like barely knowing anything. I have experience using community mapping tools, 0.4. So that's almost like barely any knowledge. I have experience and feel comfortable with providing public testimony, which is 1. So that gives you an idea of what our community members in that training, knowing the knowledge of redistricting. So after the training, so it was a 3-hour training. So we did introduction to redistricting. We did how to do public testimony. We did a case study too, like how this impacts us. There was a case study on Chinatown where there was 4 districts in that particular Chinatown. So when a natural disaster occurred, none of those 4 districts wanted to provide funding for whatever that they needed at that time. So they were bickering about who should be paying for that, since there's 4 districts in that Chinatown. So that was something that we highlighted in this training. And then we did mapping. So we did breakout sections using the mapping tools. So after the training, we did ask, How do you feel about redistricting process in your state, which is 4, which is a really big increase. I have experience in using mapping tools, 3.4, so that was a dramatic increase. I have experience and feel comfortable providing public testimony, which is 3, which is good. Like we feel like this training did help out a lot. And also I wanted to share with you some of our resources. Can you see, do you see a website? Okay.
Yeah.
So if you go to, I could drop it out the link right now, but we do have, let me see. So it's anhpi.org resources. And if you scroll down, we have redistricting resources. So,
Jennifer, why don't you put that in the chat and people will be able to access it. Just because of time, I want to get to some questions. So
okay. Okay, I'll put it in the chat so you have some time to review. So we do have the webinar, which is the middle one. The left is the PowerPoint of our training. More redistricting resources is information on in language, fact sheets and stuff like that. So check it out. And
Great.
then quickly, I could share with you like research. Did a study on Asian American messaging on redistricting. So this is what they came up with. They
was this specific to Arizona?
No, this is national.
Okay.
So this is specifically for Asian Americans redistricting. So they did survey 1,200 people, but I'll do a quick thing. They wanted to, so one of the things that they say why redistricting matters to the community is because it gives the opportunity to elect people who represent our community and share our values and backgrounds. So that one was number one in messaging in terms of why does it matter. And then the next one, which is children.
Okay, let me ask you, because I think that's very valuable to have in the chat, but more specifically is your experience in Arizona. What issue, and you discussed this with me when we talked by phone, what issue matters most in your experience reaching out to AAPI audiences around representation? And I believe you said it was voting rights.
I would say voting rights, and then I would say children, because when we were talking to people in terms of, like I did a roundtable quickly on like what redistricting, why is it important? And I would say the children and education, because a lot of the parents who do pick their schools, they drive 40 miles away or 40 minutes away, because in their district, they just don't feel comfortable with the schooling. And it does come, values is important. So when they are picking their schools, it just doesn't align with their values. So they're willing to drive almost like an hour. And my students, my interns, same thing. They're like, yeah, we have to commute quite a bit. So that's why redistricting, it's like, it does impact education. It does impact resources.
Directly.
And so I think that's key.
Great. We have a question from Tina Ji from Chinese American News. Tina, do you want to ask your question?
Can you hear me?
Yes. Please,
okay.
Please be brief, Tina, and it's great to see you.
Great to see you, Sandy. I will have a question for Jennifer.
Yes, what is the question?
How Americans, how Asians are engaged in the Arizona redistricting?
Great.
I mean, in terms of public hearing, like I mentioned before, there was close to none in other Asian communities, except like me and some other people that I brought. But I think the issue is because when we did the outreach, during that time, I mean, you have to think about we're still in a pandemic. So when I asked people if they were going to go, They said that they were concerned with COVID and they didn't want to go in person. So I think it was important what Reginald Balding mentioned is that why don't we have this in virtual? Because that, I mean, I'm pretty sure a lot of our ANHPI community would have showed up, but if only if it was virtually.
Great. So these are what each of our speakers is doing is giving us in the media sort of starting points for further reporting. So I will be sending, and Oni will be sending out contact information so our reporters can follow up. It's hard to do justice to the many questions we have. And I know that there is so much interest in what each of you is presenting. So I'm going to go to our fifth speaker now, Janie Parrish with the Navajo County Democrats, who will talk about the stakes in fair redistricting for Arizona's Native population. So Ms. Parrish, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Sandy. Yat everybody, Jenny Parrish and Chia, the Bethlehem Nishlet, Ashim Bashishim. I'm originally from Window Rock, Arizona in Kayenta, and I am the current executive director of the Navajo County Democrats. I was the campaign director for Northeast Arizona Native Democrats, and we are a cross coalition, Northeast Arizona Democrats, of Navajo County, Apache County, and Coconino County Democrats. And we are Native organizers and non-Native allies and volunteers that are working collectively to make sure we have a stronger presence, not only on the Democratic side, but just in general things like redistricting, and of course, all the other political and issue advocacy efforts. We noticed there's obviously a big gap. And so we stepped up to kind of help fill those gaps that were mentioned before. And we had many organizers and volunteers attend various meetings across, but similar to the challenges, there was just a lack of communication, little to no notice in our areas. And thankfully, we have dedicated volunteers who are following this on our own. Otherwise, we would not have the information. For example, when I attended the problem with Navajo County, for example, I'll give you an illustration. Kayenta is about 3.5 hours away one way to Sholo, which is where the in-person meeting was. And that's in a predominantly white Trumpan era. And I mean, we have the White Mountain Apache there, but there's always long-standing racial and other justice issues there in the White Mountains. So there's a lot of voter intimidation as well. But we had no notice about the cancellation of our satellite locations. There's just been little to no education about the process in general. And so we took it upon ourselves during that first phase as a group to first try to educate ourselves, because many of us were not around 10 years doing this work. So we have to do the work of educating ourselves. And how do we communicate this to just people in our communities, regular layman's terms, not sounding like a lawyer. And so we had to come away with our own messaging. We had to develop our own communication materials because there was just nothing there. And the problem with Navajo County was we had little to no notice on the cancellation. And we were telling people for the 2 weeks that we did get notice, go to these meetings, and we were delivering our spiel at community flea markets, public spaces. We heavily reliant on our local organizers to get word out. And it 2 to 3 days before the satellite meetings in Navajo County, they were removed. No notice, no notification or anything. And so we had to try to do what we can and tell people to try to tune in online or go in person, which is impossible because you have problems with internet connectivity. And that's one of the biggest problems with this process is it's not taking into account folks like the majority of Native voters who are older and don't have phone and can't go online and can't go into these portals, can't make a phone call, send an email. They're heavily reliant on just physical presence or hard copies. So we had to be that mediator to do that. Of course, we had another segment for online communication, but we have a very specific strategy for on and off. Yes.
Go a little slower. You only have about 2 minutes left, but go very slow.
Okay, and so right, and I think that was the biggest problem. It has been the biggest problem. It's just no education. From the very beginning, we wanted, I'm hoping to see something like the census campaign, at least a little bit like that, how it's covered everywhere. Nothing. And a lifeline is our tribal radios, our newspaper media outlet, little to none again. And, or the day of, which we were surprised to see in our local Navajo Times paper. The other thing that I really felt strongly about, many people did, and when we had to go to Window Rock, so I couldn't go to Kayenta and I had to drive 2.5 hours to Window Rock, and the security was intimidating. Talk about voter suppression. We have video and footage of our elders being wanded down, patted down by young white kids that said they were hired by the IRC. And this is right in the middle of the Navajo Nation, where we don't have the issues that you would probably have in Sholo. They were not reading the area, not reading the room. And it was just very disheartening to see, and people were already pissed. Some people didn't even want to go in, but these are things that we've encountered. And again, sending an email or a phone call saying we're trying to set up meetings in your area doesn't cut it once or twice. And so there's many issues that we've documented as county groups ourselves, but we're also working with our larger state party for all of this documentation, because there's so many things, from people being turned away, little to no translation, many of the things that were mentioned before. But I think our takeaway and what we need help with is definitely that coverage of basic education. And if reporters can pick that up on their own and telling it from an individual or group story point to illustrate the complexities, that would be really helpful, because we're doing this, all of us are doing this on our own and trying to figure out ways, because who else is going to do it? Nobody. And so we as organized groups are stepping up.
Thank you so much. I'm going to hold on questions. Just say to reporters, please look at the chat. We have Karen Narasaki filled in an answer, a very helpful answer on what Jennifer presented, the research done by Lake on AAPI views on redistricting. So trying to have a parallel Q&A on chat, but let's go to our last speaker, very important speaker, who will reflect on what redistricting, how it impacts and how it's engaged or not engaged rural Arizonans. So I'd like to introduce Andrea Varela with the One Arizona Coalition and the Rural Arizona Engagement. Andrea, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Sandy. As Sandy said, my name is Andrea Varela, and I am the Community Outreach Coordinator for Rural Arizona Engagement and part of the One Arizona Coalition. I was born and raised in Casa Grande, Arizona, a small town right in the middle of Phoenix and Tucson, two major metropolitan areas. Growing up, I was surrounded by desert and open spaces. Tall buildings, housing developments, and urban areas did not exist where I was from. While rural areas have grown since then, there is still a marked difference between rural and urban metropolitan life. I first began to understand the importance of involvement in my community at a young age. Through my involvement, I began to see the disparity in resources and representation that existed in rural areas. The economy was drastically different. Urban areas always seemed to have better infrastructure and offer more resources for those in need, and minority populations were underrepresented. These, by the way, are all disparities that exist to this day. I didn't know why these disparities existed, but I wanted to know more. When I was 14, my father ran for city council. Even now, the Latinx population is hardly represented in local office, and their interests and culture are barely considered in policy or administration. When my father was elected, I started to learn the value of civic engagement and the importance of the right to vote, especially in an underrepresented community like my own. Over the past few years, I have watched as our rights and our representation have been targeted and suppressed. I have seen leaders try to suppress the right to vote and silence the voices that need to be uplifted the most. I could no longer watch from the sidelines and joined Raise in April of 2020. I became involved to take part in the fight and help ensure that every voice is heard.
Just a minute, Andrea, you referred to Raise, and I just want to say that's Rural Arizona Engagement. Is that correct?
Yes, I am so sorry. That's short for Rural Arizona Engagement.
Okay.
So I became involved with Raise to take part in the fight and help ensure that every voice is heard. Rural Arizonans often feel forgotten and left behind. A lack of resources from both government entities and nonprofits supports this. There is a noticeable void when it comes to civic engagement and voter registration programs. And Raise fills this void by creating communities of educated, empowered, and engaged voters. Education and advocacy regarding redistricting is part of that process. The drawing of both congressional and legislative lines directly impacts representation and voting over the next 10 years. One line could literally mean the difference between a gerrymandered district or a district that truly represents its community and their needs. Continuous undercounts and the splitting of rural communities and communities of color have led to lack of representation that is responsive to actual voters. As an organization, we recognize the need for empowerment and civic engagement. We recognize the need for the state to be responsive, and we recognize the need for representation and policy reform. Raise has engaged the communities we serve through redistricting education and outreach, hosting redistricting education events, providing training for submitting written and oral testimony to the IRC, and we will continue to do so in rural communities and communities of color to ensure that the maps will not silence them. When it comes to civic engagement, there tends to be a hyper focus on urban areas, and rural communities are forgotten or don't receive enough attention when it comes to policy and processes such as redistricting. This can be due to lack of access to vote, lack of qualified candidates willing to run for office, and a lack of engagement and education. For example, rural areas need representation dedicated to a meaningful commitment to rural economic recovery. Agriculture and independent farms are struggling. The USPS has lost funding. The border wall shutdown caused rural Americans to have to face mortgage payments, missed mortgage payments. And all these things were a direct result of representation that came as a direct result of the redistricting that happened 10 years ago. Representation that has not been responsive to rural communities. And with lack of representation comes lack of necessary resources, voting, and engagement. Through my experience doing voter registration, I cannot count the number of times I've heard a fellow community member say, "I don't vote, it doesn't matter, so why bother?" Throughout history, systems have disenfranchised rural and communities of color and impeded them from exercising their right to vote and participating in processes such as redistricting. From voter suppression laws to gerrymandered plans, systems have been established to dilute voting rights for rural communities and communities of color. Removing voters from Pebble affects rural areas where there are bad roads and lack of access to the ballot box. The ban on third parties submitting ballots on someone else's behalf affects rural areas and people of color who depend solely on these parties to turn in their ballots. The out of precinct policy, which prohibits provisional ballots from being counted if not cast in the designated polling place, also suppresses the right to vote. The people elected to the office that have voted for these oppressive laws and have not taken into consideration the needs of rural communities have been born from the districts that were drawn a decade ago. These communities of color and rural communities must find different ways to provide engagement and opportunity. This redistricting cycle is our chance to shape the future. And I believe in building community power, and that can only be done by targeting rural communities and communities of color and meeting them when they are at to face the issues that affect us all.
Thank you. That really, we have had 6 splendid presentations. I want to go now quickly to questions from the media on the call. We have many Arizona-based media, and we have media that have joined these briefings from all over the country. Pilar Marrero, you have a question. Can you ask it? Let's see, maybe Oni, do you have Pilar's question?
Yeah, Pilar's question is, where is the Latino population most underrepresented in Arizona?
Sandy, can you answer that? Sorry, you need to unmute, sorry. Can you unmute?
Yes, there we go. I couldn't hear.
Okay, the question is, where are Latinos most underrepresented? Where are the largest Latino populations where representation is really the most dramatic? The absence of representation is the most dramatic.
In the south side of Tucson.
Can you just give us a little more information? Many of our media are not too familiar
With that.
Yeah.
Southwest of Tucson is a big, the District 5, District 2, District 3. They have high also COVID counts that have also, but I believe would also play a big part in it because we're not reaching out to, we're reaching out to them due to the COVID. But what I'm saying is that if we don't do this redistricting correctly, that the what's happening right now will continue to happen.
Right.
With the COVID.
COVID is a big issue, and South Tucson is a heavy concentration of underrepresentation. We have a question from Don Tagala at Filipino channel. Don.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I know it's easier said than done, but if we already know that redistricting or gerrymandering is the problem, why can't lawmakers just put all their efforts in reverting these districts back to its original? I know, what are the challenges? Why is that not happening?
Victoria, could you take that on?
Yeah, absolutely.
Question, but
in Arizona, we actually have to start from a blank slate when we do redistricting. We can't just adjust district lines, so the commission must essentially throw out the previous district lines and start over from scratch. So we can't just look at previous district lines and adjust just a little here and there based on population differences. We must actually start completely over, and that's why we are currently at the grid map stage. The commission can't look at previous districts at all and try to base it from there, unfortunately.
Okay, and our last two questions, Mark Hadin, who did a terrific background fact sheet, which we will send to everybody. Mark, your question.
The question was just about what recourse do we have? I mean, I think it looks to me like the commission was not inclined to be unbiased. And
what is the strongest countermeasures we can take, which is a question ethnic media would be very interested in. What, Victoria, would you say One Arizona is sort of mobilizing your resources to influence the redistricting commission?
Yeah, I think most of our partners are doing a lot of work around just accessibility and transparency, right? Ensuring that the commission actually comes to our communities and listens to our communities. At the very least is ensuring that our voices are in the room and that there is a proven record of communities of color coming out and making these demands and these asks of the commission. We know that oftentimes there's litigation that ends up resulting here as a result of what the maps don't reflect in population. And so it's important to us that community members at the very least are given the opportunity to share what their demands are, what they expect their districts to look like. And so our community partners are doing the work to make sure that community members are aware of this process and so that they can participate as much as they can, even with all of the barriers that the commission has created.
Is there one example you can give us of where you think you've had an impact? For example, when there are interpreters, when they did reschedule a hearing, or what would you say are signs of the impact you are collectively hearing? And I would just ask any of our speakers, since we've got about 2 minutes left. Do you want to take that, Victoria or Jamie or Sandy, yes.
So I feel that the process needs to integrate more of the comments and concerns we have about ensuring both the congressional and the state regarding lines represent and acknowledge the growth in the Latino community over 3 decades. We know that this process has lasting effect in our communities, both in the resources and the representation that we get. The initial maps and information have a lot of work to do to ensure this representation. We will continue to work in mobilizing, and we need our community to have their voices heard.
Well, great. That's a great final statement. Victoria, Jamie, is there one example you think you see an impact now? Okay.
We're gonna have to wait and see how we evaluate this. But to tackle the issue that I mentioned about lack of communication, especially lack of internet, is that we went back to traditional media and communications, where we've printed large 16 by 20 maps of congressional and legislative districts, so people can visually see what's going on, and to have hard copies of grid maps to see what people can interact with, what can they draw themselves, an attempt to at least try to get public feedback, especially because the way the portal's working now, it's just so complicated. So we're trying this, and they did reschedule a meeting in for Navajo County with satellite locations coming up on October 7th, but again, seating's limited as well, so we'll see how those turn out.
Great. We have one last question by one of our most loyal attenders, Moshin Zahir. Moshin, can you give the final question and then we'll have to close?
Yeah, like in communities in most of the states complain that the districts in which they have majority are divided into different districts. So what is the situation? What do you foresee in Arizona, and how you could play your role to stop it,
Okay, I'm going to go back to Victoria with that question.
I think there's a number of things here. For example, if we think of the West Valley in Maricopa County, there's a large population of Latino communities there, and we want to make sure that as far as legislative district goes, we don't want all of the Latino community to be placed in a single district. That would be a step back. Currently, there are a number of districts in the West Valley where Latinos actually can elect candidates of their own choosing that come from their own communities. And so that's a big one, is making sure that the Latino community in the West Valley, for example, isn't put all in a single district with what we would then call vote dilution, right? Reducing the power that the Latinos in that area have to be able to elect their own representatives. Janie may be able to speak to this a little bit more, but when it comes to like the Navajo Nation, for example, not dividing up the Navajo Nation is another big one for minority voters, right? We don't want communities to be split in that sense. So both in the cracking and in the packing sense, right? We don't want to lose the power that communities have to be able to represent multiple electeds that come from their own communities. And in areas like the Navajo Nation, for example, is not splitting that power when they already have that opportunity to elect candidates of their own choosing.
Thank you. I'm afraid we've run out of time, but it is always great to end when people have more questions and want to know more. So you've helped open this up for us, and now we in the media will be looking forward to coming back to you for follow-up stories. I want to thank the media for joining. Thank Oni for your outreach to our Arizona network of media, and especially thank the speakers for preparing and participating in today's briefing. I wish we had more time, but it was tremendously helpful getting a better sense of redistricting and the challenges and stakes for communities of color in Arizona and for rural communities. Andrea, if you wouldn't mind including your presentation, which seems you may have written in the chat, it's possible some of our media might want to republish it.
Sure, let me do that right now.
Great, okay. Thank you so much, all of you. And it feels, while not quite the same as personally around a round table, ending with a catered meal, it felt really connected. Thank you so much. Our conference is now adjourned.